I suspect there's a lot of issues to talk about here to do with the painted surface in general. There'll be three of these panel discussions, one at the end of today and one at the end of tomorrow, and then this morning's one. We found it very difficult to split up some of the issues because there are clear overlaps between some of the issues in the other panel discussions and this one. But we felt that the three case studies this morning, all representing painted surfaces, interestingly, one a painting, one an indoor sculpture, one an outdoor painted sculpture, it was worth to try and spend a bit more time, and clearly there haven't been that much time for questions after any of these talks, to really just think about that a bit more broadly. And you never really know how these sort of things go, but the sort of things that I thought we might like to address would be just to start with a kind of assessment of what it is about surface that is very important to some people in this audience, perhaps not quite so important to other people in the audience, in terms of what it means, how you measure it, how you perceive it, and what happens to an art object when that paint surface changes, primarily through aging. We can also get onto when changes by damage can happen to some kind of, I've forgotten the word. We are going to allow all kinds of participation from the audience. I'd like to sort of take the first set of questions after that, and then if we have time to look more at some of the issues about how we deal with those changes. So some of the ideas of restoration treatments to do this whole idea that's been mentioned in at least a couple of the papers so far about concept versus original materials, when those two are often in stark disagreement and you have to do something quite radical that may not tie in with some of the sort of ethics of conservation that we're all taught, and look at some of the issues, in particular this idea of repainting. And then maybe the sort of more general pros and cons of some of the methods of preventing these changes. So, I don't know, I think, IJsbrand, can I start with you, just to sort of get us going? What is important about a painted surface?
Well,
I didn't say that easy.
Well, let's say a modern painting.
Sorry, yes.
I think there's a big difference between a traditional illusionistic window kind of painting, where you actually do. I think the beholder. I think the beholder is very important, and it's we do not. There's not very much research at all about the relation of the beholder and the observer in relation to, for instance, restoration. I think that's a very important part here. Also because the modern art, let's say modern painting surface, it's not a repression of the surface. You know, for the illusionistic, you repress the surface because it's disturbing. But a modern paint surface, very much modern paint, a modern paint surface, there's an articulation of the surface, and especially of the three-dimensional part of it. So the beholder is moving also. You know, it's kind of, and I'm really curious about also the Newman presentations. Because Newman really, he writes also, you know, he writes this kind of instruction that you should be near to the surface. But what happens there? You know, it's a kind of that you move there because there's no illusionistic part of it. So there's a lot of sensorial, let's say, things which are happening there we don't know. So that's one. I think we need more research in that also. Another one is, I think, which is neglected in modern painting, is what we call the material iconology. So if you look to, let's say, painters like Kiefer or Polke, it's the material. You know, it's lead, or it's straw, or it's... So that has nothing to do with color, or it's not a color, it's another iconology. And also there, we need much more research what that means for us also as conservators and we behold. So there's so many aspects to surface, you know, but I'm really interested in some areas we could identify also for this kind of collaboration with art historians, and to really do more research in that, because we need this kind of knowledge to recognize also those things.
Coming down to the first sort of non-conservator, Stephanie, I mean, do you agree? You were nodding your head to a lot of that, and sort of myself from the conservation side of things. We hear time and time again that art historical research, so much is done with looking at photographs rather than actually the sort of in situ, in the flesh examination of the objects themselves. I mean, is all of that lost? What you're getting from a painted surface if you're just looking at images, or a good quality digital image?
Absolutely. I mean, my background is really in old master drawings because I was at the Morgan Library most of my career, and it's been really fascinating to move, and that's why I think I was nodding a lot, the difference when you said you mean in modern painting, because it's been fascinating to move from, a place where you could only look at the original, and we all firmly believe that, into an area that can sometimes be considered simply conceptual. But I guess, I'm also nodding my head and thinking because coming to Oberlin was so comfortable, because even the idea of looking at contemporary art, which Ellen Johnson really started at the Allen, was all about the original. And even though, she pushed this art of idea to the students, it was really about that original piece and taking a risk in many cases. I started out first, then I knew it was too long, a Kusama that we acquired at about the same time, also a very interesting Sam Gilliam piece, a sawhorse piece with a painted canvas, huge conservation risks that she took problems in a lot of the works that we acquired early on, because that object was so important to her, having it there, even though down the line she knew there would be issues, which for a small museum becomes more difficult given budget, etc. So yeah, I mean, I'm from the old school. It's all about the objects. So.
We'll have a chance to, I think, discuss that more generally in just a second. I want to pick this up, bringing the sculpture side of it into particular. Julie, do you think that similar sort of issues are important in painted sculpture than are in paintings, in terms of surface, of loss and texture?
Yes.
Is there anything additional? Is it recognised as just as important?
I do think it's very important. That's one of the reasons why we've been doing so much research on how the Lichtensteins looked originally. And I think it's just coming from if you talk about outdoor painted surfaces, it's very different from, conservation is going to be very different from your approach on indoor pieces, obviously. And it's pretty much understood that, yes, we're going to have to repaint. And so it's also understood that, yes, we're going to be losing those original surfaces. And so that's something that I'm really constantly thinking about, and also with Roy's work, is how do we document that original surface? And because Heather is right, when you repaint, even though there are these industrial processes, there's a very human element to this. And you could never really exactly recreate how something looked originally, I think. Paint manufacture, the products change. They may have different pigments. They may have different translucencies, gloss. It can be very challenging to really recreate something. And how important is it to do that? And that's really a very good question. And another interesting thing I also am interested in is how important is it when you are repainting to recreate using the original paint system. So, I mean, Heather, you chose to use the epoxy again, even though you knew that's not really ideal.
Actually, the first paint layer that he had on was not necessarily the epoxy. It had always been described as enamel. We did not do analysis on it, but so the paint sample that he sent us did not necessarily reflect the original paint put on it. I'm not sure that LeWitt would have even known exactly what the paint was at this point.
Yeah,
so
that was one of the problems, actually, that this was one of the first two pieces, and we didn't have the records that you all did, and in fact Saul didn't really care that was interesting. And I said to you how important the object is, and then I turn around and we strip an indoor sculpture. So, so there's all these incredible conflicts that we felt ourselves.
Right.
I think the funny thing with the LeWitt and the fact that he sort of theoretically doesn't care about the materials, he still was somebody who had done a lot of sculptures in wood and apparently moved away from wood when a critic commented on the wood grain that they could see. And he didn't want that romance for the materials, and so then he moved to metal. As he became more financially viable for him to do those things. But I can't stress enough that when you get to the point with the conceptual artist and this idea that the materials don't matter, it matters to the people who have to fabricate them in order to get those materials not to have the romance and the attraction of touch. It takes a lot of craft from those people to get that out of those materials. So the more the materials don't matter in some ways, the more they end up do mattering, and this sort of catch-22 that LeWitt was in. And I think he sort of knew that as he went on in his career, that he was in a catch-22. I don't want it to be about this, but this is dragging down my ideas. So, and the first sculpture was destroyed because of condition problems. So,
well, certainly, Roy was always available to learn about the next paint system, and this is what we're finding out, is that it was whoever came in the door next with a better way. His surface, in his painting as well, certainly was about the aspiration to be unmodulated and without the mark of the artist. His paintings have a laborious 15-stage way of getting to a denial of all the painting that he was actually doing by hand on these mechanical-looking things. So there's a great inversion of expectation. The surface for him, as we come to a better understanding of Roy's involvements with this, certainly to me is basically a carrier of visual color mass. And so the surface, whatever the surface was it was all about color. And whatever would allow that color to live off, visually in front of the hard surface, whether it was a painting or a sculpture, it seemed to be the more dominant issue. So it was always discussions of color, and it was always discussions of how you get the blue, which is one of the squirreliest parts of any of the Lichtenstein paintings and or sculptures, ultramarine and the various things, was this, and the chemistry was less involved. The idea of setting up the million color chips, which the foundation finally did, to be able to map every one of the objects to see if, in fact, there is a consistent intentionality from the point of the artist. But we're working this out in reverse. And so if we're working backwards from now, just looking at everything and then figuring out if they line up, if the 70s is indeed different than the 80s, the 80s is indeed quite different from the 90s. And because you had different fabricators, they had different ways of treating their surfaces, they had different ways, the way they did the in-cut and the infills and then in works in the 2000s that we're doing posthumously, it's trying to find a blend that is consistent with all of that. And at the same time, not trying to pretend that we are the artist in this way, but that we're doing a faithful job.
And then having learned that, there's also the question when you're repainting is, do you recreate in the fashion that it was done originally, which, because in 84, the three brushstrokes was hand-painted, and it was using the Magna system, which isn't as stable as Emron or All Grip. Do you recreate with that, or then do you do a different system and do something more that he was doing in his later years? So.
Well, the interview of James, the painting assistant in all cases was frequently they had been set up to be sprayed, and the shop was so far behind that then they were sent to Roy's studio where James would hand paint them. And he actually hand painted a 30-foot piece that's in Paris, but it was to make deadline. And so then you have this kind of accommodation of this, and then with no irreverence, I do think that Roy was trying to get his money out of paying his assistant. So it was also to get a good work product and keep James busy sometimes, where he was, you can paint that, go to it. And James is an artist in his own right, as well as a surfer, as you could tell by his boyish hair and demeanor, and is a great spirit to this, but it was involved in this very small unit of a builder, a painter, an assistant, and let's get the color right.
I think something that somebody asked, well, what is the medium in which you choose to document? So I think what sort of emerges from a few things that have been said is that, first of all, after all these years, you actually have more information that might lead you to the conservation and art historically correct thing that actually wasn't done by the artist, or wasn't the decision that was made. Is that not what you're suggesting, that maybe actually the way Roy carried this out was expedient at that moment and doesn't fit with the conceptual other ways? Anyway, so that there are multiple reasons why it might have been done then, and then multiple reasons why you might do it differently. And part of that, it sounds like, has to do with the documentation that remains to you and the sort of total picture that you're able to put his choice at that moment into, which I think is, in and of itself, sort of very interesting about this collaboration between art history and so on. But it also has to do with what is preserved and the kind of the materials that you see historically. So that's one thing. But I also think then there's the constraints of the documents themselves and what they're able to produce. So one of the things in terms of the Mondrian was this very strange feeling that there was a necessity to create a record of this painting so that it could be conserved, because they knew from the very beginning that it needed conservation sort of the day that they discovered it. But the go-to medium wasn't photography and wasn't the kind of record making that actually maybe we would have thought or expected. So the odd thing was that also you couldn't make an exact copy of it, because that too would instantly fall apart, presumably. So this idea of making a painting of this work would automatically put the conservation object or document into some other kind of interpretive frame. So all of these, I guess I'm saying, are interpretive documentation. And what you've all been describing is, the ways in which the constraints of trying to work both with the documentation that you have and the process and so on makes that idea that the artist is going to decide anything really very fragile or maybe utopian, or maybe just, kind of impossible to recreate those historical conditions as much as we today want to use the computer or something else to get back to whatever that was. So it just seems to me that more knowledge is more, but it also then seems, to open up onto, for the conservator, perhaps, and maybe also for the art historian using all of this material to interpret, or for, anyway, our combined kind of historical desire to keep the object alive or whatever, that you have many more possibilities of how to be truthful to the original. And I don't know. I mean, I think all of you probably have those kind of problems all the time. There's not one truth, obviously. You've all just said that. And I think that's what makes this whole problem for art historians so compelling, that it requires for everybody interpretation. And there aren't, as much as there's science, there are no facts.
Yes. We had coffee a week ago, and you mentioned, Nancy, that sort of looking at objects, it really isn't being taught in art history courses. But in some art history courses.
No, but I think that even your premise, art historians deal with reproductive images, and we in the museum don't. I think it's a problematic assumption that goes out into the world that there's a gap between the two, that I think all the art historians here, many of them have a lot of knowledge of objects.
I'm trying to be a little bit provocative here.
I think I'm, of anybody, I feel I do. I think, there are problems about teaching with secondary materials.
But I mean, when you first saw Victory Boogie Woogie in the flesh, were you prepared for what you actually saw on the surface from, presumably you had seen images of it beforehand?
Well, I think one of the things is just knowing in preparing this presentation, as I said to IJsbrand yesterday, I'm not really positive, do these things look different enough? The ones that were made to look like it was finished look so much like, the object, and the object that we have has had so much happen to it that it's very clear that it didn't look like, and I guess none of these things sound like they look too much or exactly like they did when the artist, the last time the artist saw it, put it that way.
I mean, the flip side of that, maybe either to Jack or Stephanie, when you kind of see the huge amount of work and resources that goes into, from the sort of conservation angle, to get a surface right. I mean, do at some point you think, this is too much? You guys are missing the bigger picture. You're being sucked into this.
Exactly. Well, yeah, we thought about that a lot too, but we did. I can't stress enough how much having Saul's input was so critical, and but we were so aware of how his view had changed, but yeah, we asked that question.
Yeah, I think there are moments where you can get overwhelmed by the details and lose the bigger picture. I mean, I was terrified when we unpacked all 49 elements, and I could see them in gallery lighting, and there were ones that I started keeping a list, and I still have that list where I thought, I'm taking this one back to the painters. They're going to hate me, but I'm taking this one back. But when they were all together, all 49,
It was perfect.
I don't think you could. I did a couple of touch-ups locally, but there are moments, I think, when conservators do lose the big picture. It's very easy to be seduced by the microscopic, but you do have to step back or you drive your painters nuts and you won't have any friends.
And I mean, Jack, how about you? It isn't every day you hear a director of a foundation talk about Magna and actually makes a paint and sort of understand that level of detail. I mean, have you sort of been sucked into this a little bit, or do you still think that we get just a bit too precious about it?
Well, this is a truthful moment, and I really don't want to pretend that I'm unaware of these things after 27 years working with conservators on museum collections. So it's been a shock to be brought back into this, but it is I justify it because of the involvement and what I've learned in the process of all of the materials that we do have in the studio. And I think that this is our stewardship, is the fact that we have the paint pots and that we have the color and then Magna samples and we have the cut papers and we have the drawers of this material, which I probably more than many of the other studio assistants actually esteem and have made sure that they didn't throw them away or that didn't get banged up too much as the last record. And so if anything, we have been trying to become the database of everything and to get more involved in detail and of the specifics. I must say that I did a little art in my youth, but I certainly began to blank out when we started talking about clear coats and intervening layers and stop outs and all these other kind of technical arrangements that the assistants just take for granted, or looking at Roy's recipes that he was writing to his assistants or to others about this is the way you do this, and then of course at the end it says, and do as many coats of this as possible to get the desired color effect. And so there is even that he still leaves open-ended, and I think that's a fascinating piece of information to keep us honest, and that these were advisory, and my position in here is just by default, I suppose, because we're having such fun working on this piece. and doing this inventory of all other known Lichtenstein exterior sculptures. But we have to, and it makes me think, it makes all of us think at the foundation about the history of Roy Lichtenstein, in the fact that I was sitting here, I have a list of the 26 different sculptural media that he used from 1949 to 97, and about 90% of them were machine made. I mean, they were gilded, they were glossed, they were hard edge. He worked for Republic Steel in Cleveland for a while, designing desks that were then being mechanically sprayed. And so we're trying to figure out consistent areas of interest. His work in ceramic, his mosaic, and the enamel work that he was doing. He was looking for things that were durable, that were glossy, that looked unhandmade, and that would be slick. And so when we've had even discussions of, Julie threw me the curve of, well, what about gloss? And it was, oops, we can't assume this, because there indeed is a different gloss in these exterior sculptures over 30 years, even as they were done the first time around. And now with all grip, you can see that they are the glossiest. And James de Pasquale would say Roy was always going for the tightest paint system. It washed better. You didn't have to wax it as frequently. So then you have to cross-cut this with, maintenance issues.
Yeah, but he made that decision because of durability, not because of appearance. I mean, if he had it, I got the feeling talking to James that if he had his way, which is also interesting to document, and I think important for us to be documenting just for reference, is that what did the artist really want? What were they going for? And then what compromises did they make? And I got the feeling from James that if he could have, he would have, used Magna outdoors. I mean, he wanted the colors, he wanted the hues, he wanted that kind of matte quality, and but he knew that they wouldn't last, so he kind of compromised. He said, okay, well, we're going to use polyurethane, I can't quite get the color. It's going to be glossy. Oh well, that's okay. I'll accept that. It's more important that it lasts. But I still think it's very important to understand and kind of document that, if you can, the compromises that the artists do make. And I think that can, in a way, that can really affect your ability to kind of make a decision in the end on how you're going to approach this, which aspects of appearance and color are important. So.
No, and 50 years from now, I mean, it's all gone. I mean, we're not here. All of the assistants that worked for the artist are no longer here. The memories are dimming as we speak. And so at our kind of last minute in working on the actuarials, every time, James is a surfer and he goes to Costa Rica and does deep water, very high risk surfing, we skip a beat. Our heart just goes, uh-oh, please come back in one piece. And it usually happens right after a shark attack in Australia, where you think everybody is going to get chewed up. But he's an independent person. We can't chain him to the studio. But I've had the thought. We have an administrative issue forthcoming.
I think we should take some questions. I'm sure there are a lot of you out there who have... I see one hand up here.
Hi, this is for Julie. Julie, you said that the Getty sculpture, that the red and yellow were overpainted. Could you tell if that was also Emron? And what was the clear coat that had failed? Was that also an Emron product?
Did you say, were you asking, was it Imron that was the overpaint?
The overpaint. You know, that the yellow and the red, you said you could tell very clearly the very pale that was underneath, and the red. Were they Emron products? Could you tell?
Yes. Just looking at the cross sections, I think Alan and Rochelle were able to determine that the lower layers were Imron. Original lower layers were Imron. There is an epoxy primer, Imron, and then they have been able to identify that original mixture with the Magna and the clear polyurethane. The manufacturer of that, I think we're still kind of we're fine-tuning. But we do have in the archives reference of using a Sickens brand polyurethane. And then on top of that, they have been able to identify the use of Imron paint, and then a top coat on top of that, which I believe is Sikkens as well. But we're still kind of fine-tuning that.
But you know, that very separated layer on the black that you showed in the slide, which is very clear that you see on a lot of Lichtensteins, could you tell what that was? You know, that's separating from the magna and separates from most of the colors? Have you been able to identify what that is?
I'm not sure I could say definitively.
Okay.
No, sorry.
The other thing is you said you're setting up an archive of pigments for Lichtenstein. And yet when I go online or when I've discussed it with the foundation, it's going to be really difficult to replicate those, since when you know, it says Emron for BMWs, Emron for Chevy trucks, whatever. So what will really be the reason for that? I mean, it's not as though we can really replicate that. You even said yourself that, you know, you used the ultramarine and it didn't really match. What did you use with the clear with ultramarine?
Absolutely. You make a very good point that I wasn't able to really get to. And you're right. One of the problems is, I mean, you can say, okay, that he originally used Imron. You can even give a code number. You're right, Chevrolet Blue or whatever. And they often are code numbers. But those change, and the manufacturers change these numbers. So, but part of the reason for doing the analysis is really for archival purposes and also, you know, for reference. Also, you reference in being able to, when you're analyzing other Lichtensteins, you can have reference samples in order to identify different components or materials. But what we are also doing, the reason for looking at the pigments and the mediums is really to listen to we're listening to what James, the assistant, is saying he used originally. And then we're also able to, by using the analysis, see if what he says coincides. Is that true? It's just another way of documenting what original paints were used. Now, when it comes to actually using that information to repaint, I think that what's useful to know, because pigments have a very specific kind of reflectance curve, for example, we're using colorimetry. You can actually know a lot just from colorimetric measurements about a material, the pigments that it's using. That can be helpful when you're trying to recreate a hue or a color. I think that those are, and also we've been discussing that we have a goal to make a set of actual swatches on metal with polyurethane paint that really are examples of all the different colors that Roy used. And then we can do analysis of, or we can do color measurements of those, gloss readings and such, have them approved by James as acceptable for us, so that in the long term we can refer to those and try and match whether or not we use the same materials or not. I think that's open for discussion. But
have you found an acceptable clear coat?
We haven't. We haven't been dealing with.
And what are you using instead of magnets, since that's no longer, you can't apply that anymore?
Right. Well, we haven't decided what we're going to use to repaint. When I did my treatment, I tried to use a compatible medium. I actually think that we need to do a lot more research on, you know, the compatibility of different polyurethane paints. Can you use all grip with Imron? I'm not sure. I mean, all grip's very brittle, Imron's very rubbery. I'm worried about compatibility. So I tried, you know, it was nice to have the analysis and know that it was Imron, because then I was able to comfortably in-paint locally with what I feel would be a more compatible system. So I chose Imron at that time if I could. And of course, you know, with the challenges of doing color matching, you're limited. But yeah, that's the goal. That was
there were some other questions. One over here.
My name is Anne Wagner, and I wanted to say ask in the wake of this very interesting discussion something about how both art historians and conservators operate within, let us say, the protocols and ethics of their different disciplines. I've heard actually quite a lot of overlap in terms of the kinds of things that we collectively pay attention to, and there's been an enormous amount of sensitivity to issues of historical time and the changes in an artist's intention. We're not taking that as fixed. we're taking those nuances, as well as the nuances of historical documentation, to be important, and as well as the nuances of the transformation of materials. But it occurs to me that this raises the question of when our ethics get in the way, and if they do. And there was a moment in the presentation about the LeWitt's own intentions and the procedures that were eventually followed that opened the door to thinking about our own professional blinkers. And it was LeWitt's expressed intention at a stage of the realization that these works needed care, that they should be done by an auto body shop. And I want to ask why that isn't actually you said that wasn't done because you couldn't afford it. But it could have been done at a later stage. And obviously, there are many explanations which concern risk and, curatorial probity and museum property, and also what we consider to be standards of display. But the experiment might well have been worth trying. It certainly was within the intentions of the moment from which that piece emerged. And, you all have in common the issues of mechanical touch or lack of touch. You would have gotten it, and if you had run with it and not had, nice, friendly painters.
Can I just say something about the types of shops? Because I've also dealt with an auto body painter who was very anxious on some issues to work with me on another Oldenburg sculpture. They actually work with very similar materials, and there's a lot of crossover in terms of what they do. So they are familiar. It's still a spray application, an industrial spray application.
Actually, I'm not so interested in the question of the technique at this point, but rather the fact that it would be, you could actually have a mechanical process. Just say, don't call me.
Actually, the auto body shop is also applied by a person.
Well, I know that, again, my point is not that there's not a person behind it, but when I take my car to the auto body shop, they don't call me and say, could you come in and inspect how I've done it? I pay $700 and they give me my car back. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to have the thought experiment of recreating the conditions under which our standards do not intervene, and we don't ask them to think our standards.
Yeah, I see exactly what you mean, and I agree with you. I think that it was very interesting because there was this discussion, and I see where you're coming from, that it doesn't really matter about the final, what the final product looked like and whether they can look identical or not, but it's the idea behind where to go. And in fact, in the end, he didn't care. And he said, because I said, to Janet, and we were talking about things, and, he was quite ill, and we were trying to sort of get his feelings about this, too, that I said, well, we do have a note in the file, an auto body shop. And she said, no. And I said, well, you have to, double check this, because this is really important. Should it be that? Is that, and she said, he wants it to be, he wants it to be restored. He was extremely unhappy when it wasn't restored, or the museum apparently couldn't get restored for the San Francisco MoMA exhibition. And although they put it in the catalog as a full fold-out, it couldn't be exhibited there because it had already, many of the pieces, or a number of them, had fallen apart. So I said, well, we need to think about that, and is that something? And so I think in the end, when we talked about it, he said, oh, whatever, an industrial painter. I just want this, restored in this way. And that's when, certain questions came up about a variety of ways of doing it. And I don't think it was really about cost. Did we say cost? Because I don't necessarily think it was.
You had mentioned originally, it took the Allen had applied, before Stephanie got there, had applied for IMLS funding to conserve the piece.
I see.
So it actually took a long time from the moment that the first proposal was made to repaint it, which I think may have been, 96 they were discussing it, and maybe 99 was the first proposal. It actually took a long time before the institution to be able to commit the money to do
So it
it. It's a
wasn't-
big undertaking for a small
But it
museum.
wasn't cost because of auto body versus
No.
at all. So that was not in there. But so the conversation was that there was this original note in the file about the auto body, and then that was something that was like, no, that's not important. Now where that comes down to, I don't know. And I agree with you absolutely. If maybe there's that moment where the first thing that's said is the actual intention, or whether later when we went back and tried to clarify about how we should approach this, and they were perfectly happy with us moving forward as we were, and we gave all the pros and cons and we talked it over, whether then, maybe because we saw that note we should have just gone that route, but in fact that wasn't an issue.
You might attribute too much romance to the idea of the auto body shop. In keeping with his larger concepts, no, I'm just saying that in a sense we handed the painting over to another individual who did this professionally, and I think it's still within the spirit of handing it to an auto body shop. I was not there the whole entire time that it was painted, so.
I just want to, pardon me, want to follow up on what Anne was saying, and ask, the example that the Mondrian, despite the fact that Yves Allen said he was more interested in ideas than in paintings, which I might agree with, based on Nancy's research, I think a lot of people would question whether we can still really call it a Mondrian. On the other hand, much more radical interventions to the surface would be done to something like the LeWitt or the Lichtenstein, but we don't have the same feeling about, is it still one of their works, or that sort of horror, the shudder that you get when you see Nancy go through what happened after Mondrian died to the painting. So maybe you could comment on that.
I don't understand exactly what the question is. So maybe you could.
Well, that for something like a Mondrian painting, any notion that it was changed after he died,
yes,
makes us really question even the very authenticity of the work itself, while the other examples are radical interventions, complete repainting, etc., but it doesn't seem to carry the same fraught qualities as the Mondrian example.
You mean kind of the authenticity or patina, or this kind of qualities of
Or just like a gut reaction. Like I know exactly what you mean when you look at the surface of the Mondrian with the tacks and the tape and the feeling of that. Like it's a gut reaction, like I get when I look at the Hesse. That is something you think about.
Authenticity, historical experience. You mean the historical, that kind of feeling.
Or at
yes.
least that's how I feel.
Is that you?
Maybe one way to think about this is that later on there have been very major interventions during the period, like around 1970, when one of Mondrian's designs for an interior was made in Formica and exhibited in a gallery together with his drawings, and it was sanctioned or whatever. This comes back to the artist isn't there, so the voice of the artist is, at that time, his heir, the estate, Harry Holtzman. He's the one who organized doing that. And he thought that was really... so it was a red, yellow, and blue Formica interior that Mondrian had never built in 1926 when he designed it. But it was shown in New York in that form. And so at that moment, Harry Holtzman thought Formica was the material that Harry would have wanted to realize. That would have been the ideal material. So that's one example. And there are others where Harry took off, or in one case recreated, tape from a picture that had deteriorated at least as much, I guess, as the Sol LeWitt had deteriorated. However, he never took a photograph of the object before he took all the tape off and put on his own tape. But I think part of what Andrew is talking about is this difference between this sense that sort of those works by Mondrian kind of like got taken up into an interpretive moment when the Sol LeWitt was made, and Sol LeWitt was thinking about making, having them painted, whether originally or repaint, when they had to be conserved in a body shop. And the question is, what happens when Mondrian kind of like, we're in that interpretive moment? Like, obviously, we're in some other interpretive moment where we have so much historical material that we're overwhelmed by the historical material, and actually, we might not go to the body shop, or we might not paint the original materials, even though we know what they are.
Well, the goal is different. The goal is not to make, I think we should not try to make imitations which are the truth, because that's the utopian criticism you have. I think that, for me, that's clear. So what is now the alternative? And then we come, let's say, if we can look to the Victor Bookie as a document, and we make an incredible amount of stories out of that. But those stories will be always different. And I hope I can cite one. A few days ago, I was reading an interview of Carol Stringari with Bryce Marden. And he was talking about his paintings, let's say, and he called themselves the Pompeian, the colors of the wall, Pompeia. So, and he then says, I think the interview is 10 years later, and he's busy with completely other paintings. He says, oh, it's so strange, because now those paintings look for me very dull. But at that time, they were bright orange, and every restorer will know when you are retouching in black, then suddenly you will discover a lot of colors, and all those blacks for an other eye are just black, but for you they become red and blue, and and so it is this kind of experience, also of, let's say, of Marden at that time in this context, where he looks to colors, and his experiences are so different from 10 years later. So I think I agree with Nancy that it's a utopia to think that you get hold of this kind of truth. I think this is a typical, probably Enlightenment kind of idea that comes from that area. That museums also are places where objects are kept in that way. But I think we should think of our own role in that, and that we are creating this kind of authenticity by ourselves, and that we leave that. Is that kind of, I hope, kind of answer?
Is this also something to do with age, I suppose? Yeah. Is it the fact that we place more value on the age of the Mondrian? I suspect that the pristine surfaces that we seem to unrealistically want to keep for a lot of this very contemporary monochrome painting might well have been applied to the Mondrian when it was first made, because the crack in that panel might just as sort of disruptive to the surface as it is in the Sol LeWitt or Ellsworth Kelly or something. Exactly. But now we've actually grown to value that age, which presumably maybe might happen in the next generation for the things we don't. Okay.
You also couldn't discount the fact that there may be a growing unease with the Sol LeWitt at a future date. That it may seem to be, and that I think also would change a lot if museums started to label things and they said Sol LeWitt repainted in, and I don't think people want to see that information, and that sort of gives them an unease when they're looking at it, and I think that would raise authenticity problems within that setting. So.
Are there some yes, I see Rob here. Is someone with the microphone? Is there? There's a questioner down here.
Well, Robert Proctor. It's more of just a comment than a question, because I'm completely stressed out here. I don't know if anybody else is. But, I guess it has to do with my sort of trying to reconcile, the artist's desire versus my appreciation of art. And especially when we're talking about the artist's voice and these ideas of anonymity or perfection. And because I spend so much part of my time, maybe it's because I work mostly on different sorts of art, but trying to preserve sort of what I find endearing qualities of like the artist's idiosyncrasies and his signature and hand in the art. And here we are saying, the voice of the artist says that these things should be pristine and this, but the voice of the artist is right there on the art. It's not in his, and I don't know. It's just really making me uneasy. Yeah.
See, where's the microphone? There's all sorts of hands going up. Can you?
So if that's a comment, I could agree. I mean, but it's it's the misuse of authority in some ways, or who is the authoritative case, or the idiosyncratic, and working backwards from the fact that the Getty piece, for example, is one of two. The other one was painted another way, for example, and that by another person, but in another iteration. And so it is in trying to kind of be governors of where's the thing that's most accurate, even within the metaphorical language of, I don't care about it as so much that you could actually be painted in an auto body shop. I mean, I think these are kind of symbolic languages. And since, in this case, Lichtenstein was specific but not specific enough, and still trying to work that out by recording the practices, and then you have a range of options that are there. But sure, I mean... That's what we all here find so interesting. Here we are.
Rob, sorry, could you wait for the microphone?
Well, it goes back to the school of consolidate the surface and let it continue, but at its own accelerated demise is another... it's a taxidermy
especially
problem
because the saw LeWitt hadn't been on view for 10 years because the pieces were falling apart, and and the fingerprints. I will say fingerprints, we use gloves. So in fact, the fingerprints actually, many of them were actually there and documented when the work came into the collection. So and I think that I would never have wanted to take that project on if it weren't the fact that work probably would have never been shown again, and it was falling apart, and long discussions about that, because I couldn't agree with you more. I would never ever want to take. I hope the Eva Hesse is perfect forever, because you wouldn't. It's this whole thing about the touch for that piece, as is, I feel that same way about the saw LeWitt too. I felt like it's a project I wish it were in perfect condition and not, in storage and separate pieces.
Okay, we had a question up here.
Hi, Joyce Ty. I have a quick question for the entire panel. I mean, it seems like once we have the surface scratched, I mean, literally scratched, we start having this kind of curious proliferation of objects. And we start having this whole kind of discussion where we start introducing the conditionals, the subjunctive, and it becomes really kind of problematic to focus on how we comport ourselves to what we, at different points, might consider the surface. I mean, so is it the surface that we're trying to strip away? Is it the surface we're trying to retrieve? Is it the surface we're trying to recreate? And that becomes a kind of question for conservators, of course, but also for art historians. I mean, it becomes really difficult. I'm working on Maholi, and on some of his damaged works that he also at certain points repainted, or I think repainted at certain moments. And we start kind of building up these sort of life stories for individual works. How do we start reintegrating those kind of incredibly complex life stories that have something to do with damage, that have something to do with artistic intentionality, but also have to do with histories of reception, what's shown when, because of what condition? I mean, how do we begin to reconcile those things in a kind of, let's say, art historical account? I mean, that's going to be different for, every artist, but what are some of the ways that we can begin to think about these questions in the three artists that we have today.
One thing would be to write labels, as somebody suggested, maybe in the audience, or did you? Heather, that tell the history of the condition of the object, which I think would enable people to look closely. So Tom mentioned that some people look more closely, or for some people, looking is part of what they do every day because they're surrounded by original objects and so on, or we look differently at different kinds of reproductions, etc. But I don't think the general audience, and certainly not my students who I'm teaching, often from reproductions, it's very difficult to encourage them to understand that these objects have those kind of histories. And at least in my own research, trying to find out some of those changes run very close to kind of taboos that exist. So I think you're asking a very important question, like how can we become more comfortable maybe with some of those kinds of things? And I don't, think of any survey of art history that you've ever looked at. They don't, I can't think of many objects that would be described in that way. And maybe there are other ones in, the history of conservation issues. But I think that somebody else also asked, or I think put something else into the mix, which is what is it that we desire when we go to look at objects, whether it's in a museum or a gallery or wherever. Do we want to have an aesthetic experience? Is it a historical experience? Because when I talked about this with Tom, he said, well, we have a problem with nobody wants to go to the museum and only read the label. The important thing is that object. So I think that there are many, many competing narratives. And the one that has won out in general is not the one that teaches students or novice viewers how to look carefully at surfaces and to learn what it is they're really seeing.
Can I make a comment too? I think that there are two things. One is that we probably have to think of kind of new methodologies, also theoretical methodologies. We in ICN, we are looking a little bit in the areas of science and technology studies, in the actor network theory. This is kind of theory of networks, where objects are in networks, where there are a lot of information materials, information objects around it, and that you could use, for instance, ICT and so on in it, and all kind of new technology to communicate that to scholars via internet, for instance. So I think there are, from that point of view, we are living in a fascinating time. And I think in our field we don't use enough this kind of new technologies for communication and also for students to make this kind of archives and to study, to look more for other methodologies.
We have about 10 minutes. There was a question here, and I then want to come to Christian next.
Yeah, Graham Larkin, National Gallery of Canada. I wanted to build a little bit on what Tom had, some of the anxieties that he had expressed, and turn it into a very pointed question for Stephanie and Heather regarding the LeWitt. And I guess I'm enough of a romantic, as Heather would say, to be interested in all the contingencies of manufacture at the moment of origin. The materials available to the artist, the time, the labor, the skill level, and interested in all the resultant imperfections, both at the moment of manufacture, so the drips, but also the later degradations, and I don't know when those little labels with the positioning of the object were put on it, but those two I was very stressed out to see them sort of getting blasted away.
Those were not put on by Solomon.
Well, precisely, but part of the history. But this is in any case, and my question, the question was that whether in your conversations with LeWitt, given that he was interested in making these perfect, was there any talk of just remaking them? I mean, giving the labor of stripping them down, of just saying, okay, we'll archive these, or at least some of them, one of them, and we will make them just how he wants them now. Maybe how he wanted them then too, but preserve the the object.
In preserving, yeah. We I think also when we're talking here, I'm kind of remembering a little bit at the moment of time, because of course it was talked about starting in the 90s before I was there, redoing it and the piece. And so I think we can't say that, we jumped into it and it was a difficult time, because at that point, Saul was quite ill, even in sort of the early discussions. So it had been discussed over a period of time. And I agree, it could have been refabricated and could have done it that way. But in the end, I think, bowed to the artist, and I agree. I feel I have the same feelings you do. I think about how there's this really gut feeling that if we do some of these restoration projects, then, are we losing the individual? I mean, is that individual voice, is that all gone? So I guess we just, sort of sat down and we talked about it, and in a way, I think we kind of bowed to what Saul wanted to an extent, because he was the artist. And yes, I agree that there were all of these considerations that I mentioned at the beginning about, how different it was in 71 to 2004, 5, 6. And I would say, yes, I think I guess we took a stand and we actually followed what Saul wanted to do. And does that mean that it's a Saul LeWitt conceived of in, the late 60s, early 70s, and kind of redone in 2006? Just like Heather says, yes, it probably is. And that was instead of just kind of keeping these in an archive, that the pieces that we had in an archive and keeping them there, instead of just photo documenting it and keeping certain samples and everything in our archives for research, that we made that decision. So it was, I think, I agree with you. I think it was a really hard decision. And then I think that, I think it actually kept us up a lot thinking about this, whether do we respect what the artist wants, or do we say, look, let's just remake the piece? And in the end, we went with what we decided and what he wanted.
I don't think you could say, though, that it would necessarily be the same decision again now that he's passed away. He did pass away shortly after the piece was installed.
We started it in 2000. We started the restoration in 2004, and then we had it installed in this big exhibition by 2007. So yes, I agree. I think we might have made a different decision.
We'll no doubt be readdressing some of these artist voice histories, claim issues in this afternoon's panel discussion. We've got time for one more question, and I want to give Christian a chance to ask.
Yeah, Christian Scheidemann. I was thinking of it might have been a good experience to make a copy of at least some of the cubes, and then put them next to the originals, and then decide what is more authentic, which piece is more authentic. And also it reminds me of Barnett Newman. I'm still not clear about what is the difference between a painting and the surface of a painting and the surface of a sculpture. So I think we're dealing here with two different part of shoes, as we say in German.
We spoke nice about maybe bring up the Barnett Newman case later, which we haven't had time to, but I don't want to just say anything at all to round us up about the issues of that whole debate with who's afraid of red, yellow, and blue, and then subsequently Cathedra, the whole issue of repainting, the original being repainted as opposed to the idea of making some sort of copy and keeping the original as a dead archival object.
Yes, well, that was, I think it took about 5 years, and it had enormous political consequences. I talked a little bit. I don't know if should I tell the story very briefly? Well, the paintings, first, the the painting Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue, is number 3. In Amsterdam was slashed by 15 meters, cuts in the painting. And the painting, I investigated painting before, and so I had a feeling of that surface with my nose on it. And then the painting was restored here in New York. And then the painting came back. I have to be brief. So the painting came back, and then there were different meanings. Some people, like me, we were convinced that the painting was completely overpainted, or the red area was completely overpainted. The conservator said that he only sealed it, and that he had been next to Barnett Newman when he made the painting, and that the painting was made with a roller and with acrylic, and we analyzed oil paint before, and I saw brushstrokes there, very thin brushstrokes, a little bit shiny surface. Anyhow, the painting, we were convinced that the painting was completely overpainted, and the conservator denied. He said, I just retouched it. So we had an investigation. The Forensic Institute, they proved that it was overpainted with different layers. And then there was a big financial struggle between the city of Amsterdam and so on. And of course, and during that period, I think at least 100 articles has been published in the Netherlands, but everywhere, about this problem. About what is this? What is the surface? What is the original surface? And in the beginning, the director of the museum, Wim Beere, he started to say, actually, I can say he didn't see it. So he was not aware. So when he was in the studio of the Conservator, he said, this is good, and it was recorded, and so he was a good lawyer, was there, so good. But then the Conservator came, and she immediately saw that it was overpainted. So there you see already the sense, but the director of the museum said, well, this is, in the end, he said, well, even if it's overpainted, the painting got the wholeness back, which is important for Barnett Newman. And so it's not so important. And another, Rudy Fuchs, his follower of the State Museum, at that moment, he said, well, it's not important, it's a concept. So and there was really a struggle between the conservators, let's say, and the art historians about it. And then finally, thanks also, I hope I reproduce this in a good way, but also thanks to studies here, for instance, by Yves Alain and so on, where art historians were really looking also to the surface and the significance of the surface, and that it also became clear that Barnett Newman is not the same as a Kelly, it was a kind of mix-up of conceptual and hard edge paintings, which should have a kind of more impersonal surface, and Barnett Newman was, in the same group, so it was not important. But of course it's not. So now we slowly get much more studies, beautiful, good art historical studies, together with conservators. We will hear it together, where finally, through this kind of studies, we get more knowledge about all those kind of differences, different artist practices about this surface. So it's very difficult to generalize on this. It's really difficult. And we need, I think, so after that restoration, the same man, he slashed Cathedra in the same way. And then, because it had so much political consequences, we got all the room, of course, for doing now another job. And you can imagine that all the press, everything was following us. And thanks to Carol Mancusi, and we had a whole team of people also from here who are familiar with the technique of Newman. In my opinion, this restoration has been a success. And there, we did everything to retouch the cuts with I think, a rather good result. The painting hangs there, and You can look to the document. So there we still could combine those things. We could combine the historical document, and that's of course ideal.
So we're just getting very fascinating just at the end of the session. But with the restoration of Cathedra, when you see the painting, do you presumably see the shadow of the slashes?
Depends on the gaze. Okay. Depends on the gaze. No. I mean, as a conservator, I see it. Of course, I have been there. I saw it. As you know, so it's also a conscious thing. So, and sometimes, when I was there in the beginning, I saw things that other people didn't, and also the conservators saw it. So we did light them out, for instance. You know, you can do something with light, and you can do a lot of things to really, and yes, I think that was a kind of successful, but which does not say, I could very well imagine that you have both options, that you keep your document somewhere else. In the LeWitt case, that you could just keep. That's what we did with other installation pieces in installation projects. That we keep the originals and we make, let's say, new ones.
Do you think it would have made a difference, as, for example, when Ad Reinhardt apparently repainted his own painting in the Museum of Modern Art and had the artist? I mean, I think that's part of what we're talking about here.
Yes.
You know, if Sol LeWitt had said, send them to me, you know, and I'll do it.
Yes.
Which I think, you know, some people, I guess last night this was happening, or it happens all the time for the McCartney pieces.
Yes.
So I just wonder, would you have sent it to the artist to redo?
Well,
or you can't, because they're also talking about, well, it's a historically bound image.
But also there, it's very difficult to generalize. You know, it's so, I think, why are we looking for the truth here, for something, for a rule which is there? I think it's much more important to show the process and to think about it and to develop this kind of knowledge, what's happened with, also with Barnett Newman, I hope we will hear fascinating stories about. So I'm sorry, I think it's difficult to generalize.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I brought that up right at the end of the session. We have to stop now for lunch. Plenty more opportunity for these discussions later on. We're running about 15 minutes late, so we have agreed, the committee, that we will take our full hour and a quarter's lunch. So please be back here by 2:15. And please thank the morning speakers one more time.